Victimhood. I will try to share with you my thoughts and about the topic of victimhood, which is basically, if it's one of the major obstacles on the road to reconciliation. I will begin by an example. For a number of years, I was involved in teaching a course at Tel Aviv University in the master's program in social psychology, and the name of the course was Intergroup Relations, Theory and Practice. Okay? And basically what we did in the course, we had about 8 to 10 Israeli Jews students and 8 to 10 Palestinian Israelis students in the course. The course met for 3 hours every week. The first 1.5 hours was a dialogue group, which was moderated by somebody from the outside. And later on, I and other professors at the social psych area in Tel Aviv University would come in and try to associate what we saw in the dialogue groups with what we know in social psychology of intergroup relations. So if we talked about the social psychologists among us know, if we talked about social identity theory, we would try to look at the effects of social identity as we saw it in the dialogue group. And one phenomena which, and I taught this course for a number of years, one phenomena which always happened, which was almost like a consistent phenomena to be observed, was that about the second meeting, the Jewish and Arab students began the game of competitive victimhood. When the Jewish students were talking about their identity, they were talking about anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, 2,000 years of persecutions. The Arab students were talking about 1948, they're becoming refugees. And that was the only discussion that was happening in the room. It was as if there was a chair in the middle of the room with a big sign over it saying, "The real victim." And each group was trying to run as fast as they can to occupy the chair. This is the phenomena of competitive victimhood that we later wrote about, and I want to talk about some more. And I want to begin by asking questions about this very strange human inclination to stick to being victims, especially during conflict and during stress. We can think about reactions to trauma that we experience as individuals or as groups as being maladjusted or well-adjusted. What is a well-adjusted consequence of trauma? How do we know the trauma did not screw us up, left us good as we were? A well-adjusted response to trauma would be a response whereby my present and future are not determined by my traumatic past. It's a memory, it's part of me, but it's not a determining factor in my present reality, in my future plans. There are two kinds of maladjusted responses to trauma that I'm sure you are all aware of. One very well, post-traumatic stress disorder. In various levels, when people who have suffered trauma basically are reminded by the trauma each time again. For example, in 1990, when there were rockets shot at Tel Aviv from Iraq by Saddam Hussein, and there were sirens going up. People later on were afraid to even hear an ambulance running the street. When they heard an ambulance running the street, some people, not all, some people were shying away, or actually cringed. They could not listen to it. Even the noise of a motorbicycle racing the street was enough to actually bring up the memories again. And basically in post-traumatic stress, if I want to summarize what it means in 2 sentences, is that I try to avoid any stimulus that reminds me of the trauma. So I try to avoid it as much as I can. And there's a constriction of affect. My affective reactions, my emotional well-being is being constricted. It's being, if you will, narrowed down. So this is one way in which trauma may affect my present and my future in a way which is maladjusted, which is bad, quote unquote. Another way is victimhood. When people are taking their past trauma, their victimhood, and make it the center of their lives. They claim recognition from the environment for their victimhood. They want the environment to reestablish or reassert the fact that they are victims. And they basically make victimhood into the center of their identity. It's becoming a major center of identity. And it's very, very much evident when we talk about collective identity or group identities. In collective identities and group identities, and again, I will take Israel as an example, many Israeli politicians and many Israeli citizens see the Holocaust as a major defining character of their collective identity. Okay? They determine the reactions to the present in terms of the trauma of the past. They claim and demand that the outside world acknowledge their victimization, their being victims, and this phenomenon of victimhood is very much present in the life of many groups. Is a central element in their collective identities. And the question that I want to ask now is why? We know very well that being a victim is not good. Okay, we talked about the fact that being a victim is actually associated with disempowerment, with loss of power, lack of control. So why do people and groups seek the recognition of victimhoods, make victimhood into a central element in their identity? There are 2 basic reasons for that. One reason is an instrumental reason. If I'm a victim, you owe me compensation or whatever. And the other one is that when you're a victim, you have psychological benefits. You have no responsibility to fix the situation. All that there is your responsibility towards me. I have no responsibility to do whatever when I am a victim. Victimhood is basically a posture of passive entitlement. When I'm a victim, I'm passive, I don't have to move. I'm entitled, you owe me. So it's a passive entitlement. Now think about a situation where both parties to a conflict adopt the victimhood identity. Each one of them is basically claiming for passive entitlement. This is a paralysis. Nobody will move. Nobody will move. Both parties will only do one thing. They will claim responsibility, that the other accepts responsibility, or that the other acknowledges their victimhood. So a posture of passive entitlement or victimhood is a posture that can block reconciliation and is a major emotional block towards reconciliation. I've seen it many times. For example, about 10 years ago, I was involved in conversation between Serbs and Croats in the former Yugoslavia. This was the conversation. Who is the real victim? Are the Serbs the real victim or the Croats? And then they brought back the Second World War, where the Croats were the fascists and the Serbs were part of the Eastern Bloc, the Red Army. And the conversation continued about the issue of who is the real victim, who is the victim, the competition for victimhood. Now you have to realize one thing, that when we think about victimhood, it's the opposite of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder. In post-traumatic stress disorder, I try to avoid my traumatic past. I try to avoid stimuli that will remind me of my trauma. I try not to meet policemen if I was a prisoner in some camp. I try to avoid anything that will remind me. When I am in a victimhood state, I want recognition. I want to meet my victimization all the time, constantly. It's almost the opposite. Our work on victimhood, I'm talking about our current work, our work on victimhood began basically with a clinical theory. There's a clinical theory, when you look in the literature, there's nothing written about victimhood, or there's little written about victimhood as a major psychological force that drives conflict or blocks the ability to solve conflict. One thing which was a source of knowledge, an important source of knowledge and departure for research for us, was a clinically based theory by Berman and his colleagues, who actually formulated what they saw in the clinic as individual-based victimhood, where some clients would sit in the chair always and all the time being concentrated around their victimization, not being able to get out of it. And they defined it along a number of dimensions that we took, but I chose to focus on 3 dimensions. A victimhood self-state, which is somewhat like, to make it a little bit clearer, a victimhood self-state is the personal tendency to adopt victimhood in times of stress or conflict. When you're in stress or in conflict, you adopt your victim role. A victimhood self-state, the 3 characteristics that I want to spend some time talking about is, first of all, claiming recognition, which is basically what I said earlier. That is, you claim recognition from the outside world for your victimhood all the time. You want others to recognize your victimhood. The other one is displaced aggression. In the clinic, they report in their case studies that when a person adopts a victimhood self-state, he becomes very aggressive towards the therapist. He displaces the aggression towards the person who caused him harm in the past onto current relationships. And the last one, which I think is very important, and also now that I'm moving to the group level, is very relevant to there, is lack of concern, lack of empathy. When you are in a victimhood self-state, you care only for one person. You have empathy only for one individual, yourself. You have no concern, no empathy for the outside. Okay? So when you're, in other words, in simpler words, when you're involved in your own sufferings, you have no patience for other people's suffering. And you're in a victimhood self-state, when an Israeli thinks about the Holocaust all the time, he cannot have the time or the energy or the space to think about the sufferings of the Palestinians. Being in a victimhood self-state blocks concerns for others. So I will say one more word about this individual level of victimhood. A current doctoral student is doing research, and she has actually combined a personality questionnaire that measures self-state of victimhood with very nice findings in relationships with other constructs, but I leave it alone and I move to the collective level, which is of greater interest to me and to us. Vamik Volkan, who wrote about conflict and peace, a psychiatrist, I think a Turkish-born Cypriot, who began writing about the conflict between Turks and Greeks in Cyprus and moved on from there to write a lot about conflict, coined the term chosen trauma. And he proposes that many collectives, I am hesitant to use the words all collectives or all societies, but many collectives, choose one traumatic event in the past and they focus their identity around it. In the Israeli-Palestinian case, which is again close to home and easy to deal with, the Israelis have chosen the Holocaust as their chosen, nowadays Israelis, as their chosen trauma. It has become a central part of many, not all, many Israelis' identity. That victimhood of the past determines actions in the present. In the Palestinian collective narrative, the chosen trauma is the Nakba. The 1948 Nakba, which historically, it is true that the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 caused many Palestinians to become refugees. But historically, it would be fair to say that not all of them were expelled forcefully by the Israeli army. Some cases did happen, but many of them, as happens in all communities during times of war. Some people leave, hoping to come back. Some people listen to their leaders telling them, if you leave today, you may be able to come tomorrow to a safer and richer place. And some are being forcefully driven away. In the Nakba narrative of 1948, it's a black and white picture. In 1948, we were driven out forcefully, all of us, and we became refugees, period. This is a central chosen trauma within the Palestinian identity. Okay? And both societies fight over who is more victim than the other. The competition for victimhood is nowhere to be seen clearer than in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But if we look at the collective level, at the chosen trauma concept, it has the same characteristics. The same three characteristics as I defined earlier for the individual level. First of all, claiming recognition. In every meeting that I have with Palestinians, I can think about endless meetings. When I had a Palestinian colleague and a friend who came with me and we sat together, we had coffee, we had a beer, we were talking with other people, and then suddenly there was a public event, like some kind of a public interview in a radio or a television, and this chosen trauma would suddenly come up. 1948 Nakba. Our trauma is also coming up many times. We can talk about peace and what have you, and then suddenly we sit together and the trauma of the Holocaust, and the trauma, which is true. Basically trauma have a real basis in reality, but the fact is that individual groups choose to make them the key defining element of their identity, yes or no. In conflict, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I will use as an example, it has been a major defining element. Displaced aggression. Yes.
You introduced the concept of agency and responsibility in choosing a trauma.
It's not. No, no, it's not. It's. No. It's a concept that Volkan turned, but it doesn't mean conscious choice. No, it's the fact that one trauma becomes the center. One out of many traumas. I can always the example comes to mind of the Serbs whose trauma, and I think in the 14th century.
1389.
What? Yes, in nowadays Kosovo. Yeah, okay. So societies can or may not have one trauma become a central figure of their identity, and it comes especially in times of conflict. It springs out. Now, going to displaced aggression, there's a study by Vaughan and Branscombe, I think, in 2008, which shows that very nicely. When Jewish participants in an experiment were reminded of the Holocaust, I'm summarizing the study in one sentence, were reminded of the Holocaust, they were more aggressive, they were more tolerant of human rights violation against Palestinians. Okay? So taking the aggression of the past and displacing it onto nowadays enemies or nowadays rivals. So displaced aggression also occurs today. And lack of concern, I live in Ramat HaSharon, I live in Tel Aviv. About 10 or 15 kilometers from where I live, there's suffering going on. People are living under occupation. I'm going to the beach. I'm sitting on the beach in cafes and have a beer. And we're taking the eye as a metaphor for much of the social atmosphere that exists in the Israeli society, which is oblivious in many ways to the sufferings. I'm not talking about the political necessity for that suffering, for whether or not it could be otherwise. Not to that. I'm talking about the lack of concern for the other side's suffering, which is also very, very prominent on the collective level. Okay, now I'm coming to the thing that's really of interest to me: how to overcome victimhood. There's one more thing which I forgot to say, which I think is important to say about victimhood. Why exclusive victimhood? Why cannot I? What's the explanation for the fact that I need to say to somebody else, my suffering is greater than yours? I am the real victim. Why cannot I and you be victims? Why is victimhood an exclusive characteristic? It has an exclusive nature. We compete for it. Who is the real victim? And some recent research in social psychology has termed the concept of moral typecasting, which I think is very relevant in this case. Moral typecasting. It talks about, it's an article by Wagner and Gray from 2009, which talks about the fact that in human relations there are actors and clients. That's the way we're built. Actors and clients of moral actions. If I am a client of a bad moral action, it follows that you are the actor, you are the author of bad moral actions. It's almost like we have a tendency to judge moral situations in a binary manner, in the dichotomous manner. One is good, one is bad. It's a very childlike type of thinking, but in their research, they introduced very convincing evidence that showing that, for example, if in an experiment I told you about myself that I am sensitive to pain, okay, which is a characteristic of a moral client. I'm sensitive to pain and suffering. I'm a victim. Then I am not held responsible for any bad actions that I did later. So I'm either a victim or a perpetrator. That's the way we tend to think. It's on a very, very basic level, but it means that if I am the exclusive victim, then you must be the perpetrator. You cannot be a victim with me. That's one way or one explanation for the exclusivity of victimhood. It pays to a victim because then the others are perpetrators. That's the notion of moral typecasting that I thought of bringing it here. Okay, let me talk about now ways to overcome victimhood, which I think is more interesting and has more practical implications. I'll talk about two ways to overcome feelings of victimhood. By the way, feelings of victimhood have been shown by research to be negatively associated with readiness to reconcile. The more I think about myself as a victim, the less I'm willing to reconcile with the adversary. Especially feelings of competitive victimhood. The more I think about, let me put it in very practical terms, the more I think that the Holocaust, which is true, by the way, it's not a good example, that the Nakba was nothing compared to the suffering of the Holocaust, the more I compare and compete over victimhood, the less I'm willing to reconcile with the outgroup. So how do we overcome this negative characteristics of group identity, which is so detrimental to the possibility to move forward towards reconciliation? One way is to create common identity. Common identity is a concept in social psychology which is well known to all social psychologists among us, and that is that if I tell Black Americans and white Americans, African Americans and European Americans, I approach them by talking to them as Americans. I'm creating an identity that is bigger than the separate identities of the two groups. I reduce the tensions between the two groups. Okay? So if, for example, let me suggest to you that one way as to why during the communist era many of the communities in the Balkans did not fight with each other is because they had a higher identity, an overarching identity, Yugoslavia, that they could identify with. Okay, so creating a common identity that overarches our separate identities lessens social tensions between two groups. How is that relevant to the concept of victimhood? If you have any comments or questions, it would be a good time to ask them because I need it.
Whether these super identity could be created or not. You mentioned Yugoslavia, but in fact Yugoslavia was not one identity, it was different identities. At that given time, there was socialist Yugoslavia and the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and so on. So could it be created to solve the conflict? This is one of the questions. When you see a risk from, let's say, a moral risk to solve the conflict, which is to make a balance, and to say, for instance, I'm playing the devil's advocate, I don't want to offend anyone, to say the Jews suffered a lot, but the Germans at the same level, because finally everybody suffered a lot because of the war. Of course, this is not what I think. But I'm trying to understand the point, because I know some countries where this is happening. Everybody suffered a lot, and it's true that the Jews suffered a lot, but the Jews were severe, and also the Russians and the Ukrainians, and everybody suffered a lot because of the war. How can you cope with this problem, which is basically more or less legitimacy of suffering?
I don't know that I can.
Okay.
Maybe I can. Sometimes you cannot. Sometimes you cannot. Let me give you another example. Okay. For a personal experience, when a German, time has a lot to do with it. 20, 30 years ago, when I was a graduate, I had a German major professor who told me during the Second World War, he suffered a lot because he didn't have enough butter, and got up and left.
Did you respond?
I was too angry. I couldn't stand it. Because it was so much against any sensibility to talk about the Holocaust and not any battle. I got up and left. I would not have done it today. Okay, so time has a lot to do with that. But referring to your question, I'll cite one example from a South African study, a study conducted in South Africa. Gibson, in 2006, conducted a study in which he showed that the black South Africans, the victims, okay, were more, to the degree that black South Africans believed more that the whites and the blacks, the ANC, committed crimes against humanity, the more they're willing to reconcile with whites later on. So adopting a common identity of a perpetrator allowed them to reconcile more with the other side. It is apparently impossible to reconcile with the devil. And once you create, we're both devils in one way or another, or we're both victims in one way or another, it is easier to approach, easier to reconcile. You know, in one study which I wanted to cite here, that's a study by Massi, Noor, Samer Halabi, and Nourit, who did a study in which the Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Arabs, in one group, they told them, think about yourselves as victims, think about yourself and the other group as victims, think about yourself and the other group as perpetrators. To the extent that both groups thought about themselves as victims and perpetrators, to that extent, the more they are willing to reconcile with the other side. Another example which will make it even clearer, more than an experiment, the work of Staub in Rwanda. What Staub did, and Staub is a friend, and Irv Staub, who was born, by the way, here in Hungary, in Budapest, and left when he was 18 years old. What? He speaks Hungarian, yeah. And he's a friend, and we talked about it, and at first I was very uneasy about what he told me. He told me that he comes to Rwanda when he began his program, for which he became world famous. He's coming to Rwanda, and he gets the Tutsis, the victims, who were massacred with machetes by the neighbors, the Hutus. And he tells the Tutsis, you're also somewhat perpetrators. You're not only victims. What?
Because of the relationship with others.
No, not historical, psychological. He said, consider what would have happened to you if your leaders would get up on the radio and told you each day and each night that your neighbor is a cockroach that has to be killed. Wouldn't you also have been affected by such incitement and calls for violence? Consider that. So his way towards reconciliation is to make the victims understand that they are also part perpetrators. They are potentially perpetrators. That within each one of us, and I was objecting to it because I said, don't you condone, don't you provide cheap forgiveness to the perpetrators when you're doing that? I think differently nowadays, but the main idea is that when each one of us departs from this simplistic view of victims or perpetrators into the more complex human perspective that we are all victims and potentially perpetrators, I could say something very, very, almost by saying it, I feel bad. What would have happened to me if I was 16 in 1938, living in Germany? Would I not be affected to join the elite units and kill the Jews? So once I accept within myself the departure from the simplistic view of one or the other into the more complex view, in his research and in other research, this is one way to overcome feelings of victimhood that block ways to reconciliation. So this common group identity of us victims or us victims and perpetrators is one way. The other way, which I want to spend some more time on and show you some recent data, is acknowledgement. I would even say today, since it's very fresh, it's something that we're working on right now, I'm even changing my phrasing as we go along. I spoke today about the fact that when the Jewish Holocaust survivors came to the state of Israel in 1950s, in the late 1940s, 1950s, they were met with an atmosphere or with a reaction of indifference. Their victimhood was not recognized. They were asked by the society to hide it, to get under, if you will, the yoke and pull the cart of the emerging nation, forgetting about their victimhood. Talking to some people who have undergone that, my parents included, they felt that as a re-victimization. In one very famous Israeli movie called The 81st Blow, the name refers to the fact that the first 80 blows were delivered to them while in Auschwitz, and the 81st blow was delivered to them when they were trying to tell about what happened in Auschwitz, and nobody wanted to listen. So the denial of victimhood is a major psychological pain, source of pain for many, many groups and individuals. I think that the Israeli attitude towards Iran in many ways can be explained by the Iranian, especially Ahmadinejad, efforts to deny the Holocaust. There's nothing that denies you of your identity as the denial of your pains, saying that they were not there. And when we talk about relations between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Israelis, when we Israeli Jews, and I will come back to it later, deny the pains of Palestinians since 1948, and they are paining. Many of them became refugees. Many lost their homes. Many live in very difficult situations and conditions. We are re-victimizing them. Okay, so denial of victimhood is the re-victimization of the victim. And the call for acknowledgement of victimhood from the victim is a major force that can mellow, quieten the effects of collective victimhood. Let me now go to a few studies. Johanna Wohlhardt, in 2013, one very simple study. What she did, she took a bunch of Jewish students, and I think also Armenian students. In one condition, the Jewish students read a paragraph that acknowledges the Holocaust, that this was a painful, the most horrific crime against the Jewish people, against people in the history of the world, blah, 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 blah. In another condition, control condition, they read something else. For Armenian students, in one condition, they read a paragraph about acknowledging the Armenian Holocaust. In another condition, they read something completely neutral. And then she asked in both groups their willingness to be sensitive and to do work for refugees from Darfur. Those whose collective victimhood had been acknowledged were more willing to invest work for other refugees. So in other words, what does it say? That acknowledging victimhood increases your concern for other groups and people. It actually undermines the lack of concern for others that is part of collective victimhood that I talked about earlier. In our research by Boaz, Ameiri, and myself, which ended very recently, and these are findings hot from the oven, we did 4 studies. In the first 2 studies were surveys. One survey was conducted in Israel, the other survey was conducted in Palestine, in Ramallah, in the Palestinian Authority, and then 2 experiments. Let me first say something about the surveys. In both surveys, the major finding was that the more you, as an Israeli, believed that the Palestinians acknowledge the Holocaust, do not deny it, the more you were willing to acknowledge the Nakba, take responsibility for the pains and sufferings of Palestinians, and reconcile with them. And vice versa. The more Palestinians believed that Israelis acknowledged the pains and sufferings of the Nakba, the more they were willing to acknowledge the Holocaust and reconcile with the Israeli Jews. So this is a link, but something is very missing. We cannot deduce or conclude from what I've told you that acknowledging of victimhood increases reconciliation. I cannot conclude from that. Why? If anyone, I know that you know. Why cannot I conclude from this finding that the more I think that Palestinians acknowledge the Holocaust, the more I'm willing to reconcile with them? Why on the basis of that I cannot say, okay, acknowledging victimhood produces reconciliation? Okay.
Maybe it's not the answer, but it's not the same kind of
That's true, but that's not what that's what I was looking for. I'm looking for the very simple, it's a correlational study. It can be that these things are related, not, it may be the fact that a leftist Israeli believes that the Nakba was a victimization of the Palestinians and wants to reconcile with Palestinians. So it's a measure of a left-wing ideology. It's a third factor. I cannot say that if I acknowledge victimhood, I increase reconciliation. I will come to what you say later, but I think it's very true. So to be able to say it, we had to do experiments in which what we did was actually to I'll tell you what the experiments were. We had Israeli students read in three groups. Read about a study conducted by the UN in the Palestinian authorities. All of them read the same story. Three different groups. In one group, it was said that 73% of the Palestinians believe that the Holocaust was the most horrible crime perpetrated against humanity. Okay? In another group, that's the high acknowledgement condition. In the second group, they read that only 22% believed the same, low acknowledgement. In the third group, which was a comparison, no information control group, they read nothing about percentages. So they read about that, and then in a second experiment, what they thought to be a second study altogether, they were asked about political questions like, are you willing for Jerusalem to be a joint capitals for Israel and Palestine? Like, are you in favor of two-state solution along the 1967 borders? Questions about the real issues that separate the two parties. And the findings were pretty okay. Here we can see willingness to reconcile is made up of questions about real issues of the kind I just told you about. Now remember, people don't connect in their mind the two studies. They read about a survey in one study, they went to another room and filled out a questionnaire about current politics. Okay. These are significantly statistical differences in the sense that here, when Israelis were made to believe, this is random samples, made to believe that Palestinians accept the Holocaust, they were more willing to make compromises than in a control condition or in a denial of victimhood condition. There was no difference between the two. Now I can say, I'm not going to other aspects of the data, but now I can say more confidently that yes, if Bibi was to acknowledge the sufferings of the Palestinians by saying, yes, you suffered, yes, you suffer, saying nothing more, saying, yes, you are victims. If Abu Mazen was to say, yes, you suffered from 2,000 years of persecution. Yes, the Holocaust was a terrible crime perpetrated against you. That's what the data is telling us. We would be willing to make more political compromise. Okay? So the language of acceptance of the other suffering is enough to create greater willingness for compromises, and similar willingness to acknowledge responsibility for the other side suffering, in the case of Israelis, and apologize to them. And the same goes for Palestinians. We did the same study with Palestinians. Because of political limitations, we couldn't go into Ramallah to collect data, so we collected it with Palestinian Israelis. And here we find that when Palestinians, Israelis hear that 73% of Israeli Jews think that they're victims, that they're suffering because of the creation of the State of Israel, a significantly large number of them is willing, for example, to give up the right of return. Okay, to say, okay, we understand. We are willing to give up the complete right of return of Palestinians into former Palestine. Let me say one more word about these findings before we go towards the end, and before saying a few more words about Jeanne Mary. We have a study which is, you have to realize, maybe you know, that the issue of the Holocaust within the Israeli-Palestinian relations is a very hot issue. There's nothing that is more demeaning, angering, threatening to Israelis when Palestinians deny the Holocaust. Many of them do. They don't do that because they're bad people. They do that because they think that by accepting the Holocaust as a historical fact, they accept the legitimacy of the State of Israel. Okay? But many do. In one research grant of which I am part, which is funded by the DFG, the German Science Foundation, we have a partner who is a professor of political science in Al-Quds. He was courageous enough. The project deals, I will not go into the details of the project, but the project deals with the idea that meeting with the sufferings of the other party humanizes them and makes you readier to reconcile with them. So the project, one part of the project was to bring Palestinian students to Auschwitz for an encounter with the sufferings of the Holocaust. And Professor Muhammad Dajani, who is my partner to research, did that, and he was fired immediately from Al-Quds University, where he's teaching political science for the last 30 years. This is how sensitive the issue is within the Palestinian society, because of the fact that he was part of recognizing Jewish suffering, in parentheses, giving legitimacy to Israel, in their eyes, giving legitimacy to Israel. He was fired from Al-Quds University. He found another job. He's doing okay, but nevertheless, it does tell a story about the sensitivity of the issue of acknowledging the other suffering, acknowledgement of victimhood, and a competitive victimhood. By the way, the Israeli sample, the Jewish sample, has been visiting refugee camps to meet the suffering of the other side, and all kind of stopping places in the West Bank to recognize, to be cognizant of the Palestinian suffering. And now the most, I think, interesting findings is that one reason as to why we do not want to acknowledge the suffering of the other is that we think that if we acknowledge the suffering of the other, we detract from the legitimacy of our own identity. If by saying, yes, the Palestinians are suffering, I am less of an Israeli. Less. I'm detracting from my own identity. It's like I'm thinking in a zero-sum terms about identities. This is not what happens. Compared to control group, Israelis who have visited refugee camps, saw the sufferings, increased their commitment both to the Israeli narrative and to the Palestinian narrative. So they developed, if you will, acknowledgement of victimhood of the other, allowed them to develop a more complex worldview, that both narratives are valid. It's not either or, which is the way politicians usually think of, in an either or terms. Why did I say that? Because I said it. Because it's a study about acknowledging the suffering of the other, and which is still being conducted. But I think that the simple fact of acknowledgement of the suffering of the other is something which is very powerful in promoting a reconciled social reality. Yeah. Yeah, please do.
You say that Palestinians collectively deny Holocaust.
Not all of them, but many. Many do.
So practically you can say that's a kind of an ideological position by the state of Palestine because it legitimizes their political position. Now my question to you is that I understand that there are individuals who deny Holocaust, but I find it very difficult to understand that how can you go collectively against facts? So I have a problem understanding. There are documentary spheres. I mean, it's extremely well documented, well analyzed.
But
So how is that possible to go each day against the fact?
the only answer I have, I think about, is that it's very common. The phenomenon of Holocaust denial is not only within Palestinians. Professors of history here and there denied the Holocaust, and they go to a conference in Tehran where hundreds of people were there, in which the title was "The Holocaust Never Happened." So it's a phenomenon that's growing. I think it's growing up as anti-Semitism is also growing up. The phenomenon of it's not always it's not it's belittling the Holocaust. Some would say, I think the name is Furson, if I remember correctly. It's one of the major deniers, right? Furson. He doesn't deny the Holocaust, but it says about 100,000 Jews. They should believe in it. And the Palestinians, and there's a book on that, the Palestinian attitude toward the Holocaust, they do it because of the fact that they think, which is wrong, the Zionist movement was much older than the Holocaust. And the creation of a Jewish state within old Palestine was much older than the Holocaust. But in their mind, the world accepted Israel because of the Holocaust. I think there's a point of truth to that. The world was more sensitive to the idea of a Jewish state after 1945. But that's not the reason why the state of Israel exists. In their mind, it is, and therefore they do all they can to not talk about it, to belittle it, to diminish it. And, I must say that my colleague Muhammad Dajani showed great bravery in doing what he did. And he had to do it such that, like it tells you, he couldn't make it public at the university in Al-Quds, I'm organizing a trip to Auschwitz. He said, I'm organizing a trip to Poland, to Krakow. It's a very delicate issue. But, for example, I do not know, and again, I'm saying what I said before, because I'm pretty certain that if an Israeli prime minister would get up on the Knesset podium and genuinely and strongly say, yes, the creation of the State of Israel caused many sufferings to the Palestinians, and they still suffer. This would create another willingness, the acknowledgement of victimhood, another willingness from the other side to move forward towards some kind of better relations. Okay, there were some mediators in this relationship. I will not go into that, but I will go to the last point I wanted to make, and that is about Jana Mary. Jean Amery had a radio program in the Munich area in the 1960s in which he called for the Germans to be held accountable for the Holocaust, which the Germans at that time, Germany at that time, was very much unwilling to do. And Jean Amery wrote about victimization and victims, and he brought forth the position that we live in a Christian-based culture where forgiveness is exalted and holding resentment is vilified. If you're resentful towards someone who hurt you, you're a bad person. If you forgive them, you're a good person. And this, says Jean Amery, and there's more recent data to support his position on reconciliation processes, for example, in Rwanda. This, says Jean Amery, is something which pushes the victims into a position of false forgiveness. They forgive because they basically succumb to social pressure. And he says that victims have a very important role in dealing with history. Their role is to hold the perpetrator accountable. They must hold the perpetrator accountable. They have rights. And their right is for the perpetrator to do something to consume the resentment. It's not their position it's not their duty to forgive. It's a moral position. What I'm saying now is a moral position. It's not the victim's duty to forgive. It's the perpetrator's duty to do things that will enable the victim to forgive. Because if all we care about is readmission of the perpetrator in the moral community, what we end up with is false reconciliation and false forgiveness, says Jean Amery and other people who think like him. The pressure to put the past behind us and move forward prepares the ground for more conflicts and pressures in the future, says Jean Amery. And he asks the question, so what does the consummation of resentment mean? How is resentment consumed? What will the perpetrator do that the victim can feel genuinely, not resentful, genuinely forgiving? And he comes up with a concept which I found to be extremely important. This is the last line. Extremely important, the concept of negative possession of identity, or possession of negative identity. The victim must, says Jean Amery and others in his camp, must demand that the perpetrator accepts the past, the negative past, as part of who they are, of their identity. The victims, the Jewish victims, now moving closer to home, must demand the Germans to accept Auschwitz and Goethe and Beethoven as part of who they are. And now I'm moving to a personal level. Being, as I told you, very close to the victimization of the Holocaust, I was not visiting Germany until about 1995. I had difficulty. I've been visiting it ever since. I have many German friends and German research foundations. And one thing, I think, that it made it easier for me as a victim to consume my resentment has been the way in which Germany in the past 20 to 25 years since unification, has accepted the Holocaust as part of its identity. Not Germans in general, not every single individual, but the German establishment. When the most expensive piece of real estate in Berlin becomes a memorial for the Holocaust, and the German chancellor comes to the Knesset and begins with, "I am a German and responsible for the Holocaust," that means that for me, Germany, the German people, have accepted the past, the negative past, as part of their identity. It makes it that much easier for me to reconcile. Not all nations did that. The Austrians did not. Hungarians did not. The Germans did. And once they did, it allows for true, genuine consummation of resentment and a true, if you will, dealing with the past. In the language of Jean Améry, the possession of negative identity is the only way towards consummation of resentment and reconciliation. Don't allow false forgiveness or cheap forgiveness. That's the main call that Jean Améry is making when he talks and writes about victims. Victims have rights. They must stand for them. They must consume their resentment. I am reminded of that by, and I will conclude with that, by actually three basic, yes, please. I'll tell you why, because I think it's very difficult. You know, Germans, I've met Germans on a personal level, and I know other attitudes and other opinions. I'm talking about the German establishment, the institution of Germany. I think it would be much more difficult to erase all the memorial plaques in all German towns, the memorial to the Holocaust in Berlin, the museum in Berlin. It will be very difficult to do that. So in other words, the German establishment has created public actions to make the Holocaust part of who they are. It may happen that sometime it will go away. You know, but I don't think, again, with my very close personal, it's strange to say it, but I will, my very strong personal connections and ties to the Holocaust, I don't think that there is any other country, including Israel, by the way, who has made such an effort in the last 20 years, not before, in the last 20 years, to make the Holocaust a memorable, active part of who they are. I remember when I was working in Berlin about 10 years ago, and I can't remember which borough it is, maybe you can help me with that, when you see the Nuremberg laws hanging on poles, maybe Kreuzberg? Yeah, on electricity poles. You walk and you see, what? Right. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, it will be very difficult to take it off. So in other words, on the institutional public level, something has been done. Something very dramatic has been done, I think. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that, and now I'm moving to Israeli-Palestinian relations. And I've written that, and I said it, and I think it's true. When an Arab student comes to me and says, Tel Aviv University is one of the, it's a great university, one of the best, and so and so, the faculty club of Tel Aviv University, which is a beautiful green building, is built on the site where the house of the Sheikh of Sheikh Mounis was. The Sheikh of Sheikh Mounis, who is the leader of the village, lived there. Tel Aviv University as a whole is built on the grounds of the village of Sheikh Mounis. And he comes to me and says, why isn't there a plaque? One sign on the faculty club saying, here was the house of the Sheikh of Sheikh Mounis. And he says, I'm not going because of that to claim Tel Aviv University as my own and destroy the labs and the lecture halls. But I want my victimhood to be acknowledged. It will make it that much more easier for me to be here. On another level, and in a different context, I think it tells the same story. And I think that unless victimhood is acknowledged, resentment cannot be consummated. And I think that, the German example is a positive example in this regard. Not many other countries in Europe. Poland is doing something very similar now. Poland, with the establishment of a Jewish museum in Warsaw and other actions I'm hearing about, is going the same route. But basically, and with this I will finish, basically there's three positions you can take about victimhood, forgiveness, and all that. One is the position of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, who says that there are some crimes who represent radical evil. They're not just evil in the Kantian tradition. They're radical evil. It's not that the Nazis used the Jews as slave laborers. They didn't treat them as human beings. It's a different kind of level of evil. And she says acts of radical evil cannot be forgiven. That's one position. Yes. and will this a second position on the other extreme is the position of Irving Staub and Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu said, if the victims understood the perpetrator's perspective, reconciliation will come. Okay? That's exactly what Irv Staub was trying to do in Rwanda. Have victims understand what would have happened if you were in their shoes. And between these two positions, I think the whole range of what I was talking about today resides and lives. Acknowledgement is one point. The realization that victims and perpetrators, also perpetrators have needs, psychological needs. It's not all, reconciliation doesn't build on fulfilling victims' needs. Continuing our discussion from earlier, it is a social dynamics of relationships of two parties who have different needs. And okay, with this I will end. I'm almost beyond it already. Thank you. Is there any comments?
We want more.
What?
We want more.
I always ask, so I will be the last one.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for this interesting perspective. I was asking myself, and would like to give you a comment, because you were comparing, in a way, comparing this. situation, I mean, if the security situation of Israel would change, if it would make it easier for people to make these signs, you know, or if there are many other elements that have influence on this question whether a society is willing to acknowledge other sufferings or not.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. I think it takes time. Also for Germany, it took time, and I'm getting back to what I said before. I think that one of the biggest advantages for the German society has been the post-World War separation between Germans and Nazism. The creation of a Germany that is divorced from Nazism allowed it to accept its past, almost paradoxically. And I think that the Nuremberg trials have done a lot to facilitate that, but other things as well. And yes, within Israel, I believe that, you know, like let's say there's peace and 20 or 30 years from now, yes, there will be much more willingness to put signs like that. Because, you know, like I remember that in Camp David in 2000, there was a lot of discussion. The Palestinians demanded, and there's a dialogue between deaf people, I think, here. The Palestinians demanded that Ehud Barak, the then prime minister, would accept responsibility for the refugee problem. Okay? Ehud Barak refused. Maybe he did a politically wise thing, because he was thinking that if during negotiations he accepted responsibility for the refugee problem, it would be an unwise negotiating move to make. And here is the thing that was not discussed. Was the Palestinian demand based on the idea of acknowledgement and that's it? Or was it based on the idea of, if you're responsible for my suffering, pay? Pay now. Was it a negotiating stand, or was it, if you will, an emotional negotiation, an emotional give and take? Nowhere during negotiations between parties have I seen this question come. Why do you want me to accept responsibility? It's not being asked. This level of the thing that we're talking about, are not being talked about in negotiating rooms. And my assumption, maybe naive, maybe I'm stupid by saying that if I put a plaque on the faculty club at Tel Aviv University, nothing will happen. Maybe, I don't think so. But what I'm calling for is not the putting of the plaque, or at least discussing the putting of the plaque. And that's being completely absent from many discussions of that sort. Did I answer your question? Maybe. Yes.
My name is Agnes Böhm, yes. So I just don't understand, how can you compare the facts of suffering, as you mentioned, the Holocaust, with the sufferings of the Palestinians? So, because the general narrative is that there is new anti-Semitism and old anti-Semitism. So taking into consideration the differentiation between new and old anti-Semitism, so how can you not make a difference between the two sufferings?
I'm not. I don't think that there's any comparison whatsoever. And if Muhammad Ajani, at the beginning of our cooperation, didn't tell me, I don't see any comparison whatsoever. The Holocaust is the Holocaust. It's the biggest crime. And I will never deny that it's a unique event in world history. And our suffering is our suffering. I would not work with him. I'm not doing the comparison. I think that it's very dangerous if somebody took from my conversation today a comparison. I don't. But I do think that human suffering exists also beyond the Holocaust. And I want to acknowledge it, because I think it's good. I think it's respectful to the other people. It begins with respect and acknowledging their identity. But you're right, I'm not.
How we respond, for example, the holy book in Quran, Quran, what says the hatred towards Jews or other religion, how you respond to those?
I think, yes, the Quran has some very, very unpleasant statements, like if you see a Jew behind the tree, tell the tree, move away, I want to kill him. But let me tell you, Judaism has also many very unpleasant statements about non-Jews. And Christianity was the biggest murderer in the name of Christianity in the past 2,000 years in world history. That's religion. That's the most beautiful and the most horrendous part of religion. You can take, it allows, you can take whatever part you want. ISIS now cuts heads in the name of religion. But most Muslims do not want to cut heads. They want to live in peace. Many Jews, not many, fortunately, but Jews in the occupied territories burn olive trees of their neighbors. But that's not Judaism. Arab terrorists blow buses in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But that's not Islam. So, in other words, that's religion. That's why I'm not religious. Okay. Yes.
So my question is that how do you deal with reconciliation when there is a set of victimhoods? So for instance, take Hungary. There's this chosen trauma of Trianon, falling apart, which is then followed up by a kind of an image and victimhood of the West, in the sense that all revolutions, the 56 revolution and whatnot, so hundreds of thousands were killed and we were let down. And then there's lots of other lesser victimhoods, perceptions where Hungarians feel they were let down. So, of course, of all this, the biggest one is the Holocaust, is being, we try to say, it's the Germans, and it's only after the Germans came in, until then we saved Jews, and then the situation changed with the German occupation, neglecting the fact that, no, we had our very robust, homegrown anti-Semitism expressed in Jewish laws and whatnot. So now we are at a situation when we have started addressing some of the issues, sometimes in an ad hoc way, in a fragmented way. How do you go about these interlocked sets of victimhoods and yes, that's it. So how do you address each and everyone separately, or how do you do it?
You're talking about the
Yeah, the Hungarian case. Hungary towards so Hungary feels a victim. That's the problem. That's the root of the problem of the world. Lesser than that, historically, for instance, the Trianon Peace Treaty, Hungary feels wronged by the Treaty of Trianon because it lost territories and people, and then as a result, it engaged in a revisionist policy. As a result of this revisionism, Hungary followed Germany and then made this very bad deal regarding its own Jewish population and so on and so forth. So, in a way, Holocaust is interlocked with Trianon and Hungary's resentment towards the West and this peace treaty. So how can you address all this at the same time? How do you go about all this?
I'm not sure. I'm not too... But one thing that comes to mind. If I interpret the question, and I'm not familiar with Hungarian history, to my terms, I would say that what you're saying is that Hungary is both a victim and a perpetrator. It has been victimized in Trianon, and it is a perpetrator against the Jews. And against other, and the Roma, and other people. And Slovak. Okay. Okay. Now, from what I know, is that at least when you have a situation, which is very common, when you have a dual identity of being a perpetrator and being a victim at the same time, the need for agency triumphs. There's a primacy for agency. Okay? In this research, which I didn't go into, when we manipulate, when we tell Israelis, Israeli Jews, think about yourself as being the victims of terrorist acts and the perpetrators of violence against Palestinians in refugee camps and stuff like that. So you have a dual identity. And we then ask them to behave, to do some behavior. Their behavior always fulfills their need for agency, for power. The need for security is stronger than the need for acceptance. Let me say one more thing. It really ties in with Maslow's theory, with the hierarchy of needs. That you first have to fulfill your need for security and your need for existence before you can deal with your need for acceptance and other social needs. I don't know if it helped that comes to mind.
Yeah, we are building a big fence. So, yeah.
Okay.
It's more in relationship with your question. How do you comment upon this fact that you could be perpetrators by fault or creating this image, or perpetrators by intention? In the Romanian case, it's pretty similar, and people or authorities tend to say that it's a German thing, the case of the Holocaust, and Romania rallied to the German intentions in these cases. And in most of the surveys which were conducted in Romania, Romanians tend to say that it's only a German issue, although the Romanian authorities had their direct role in terms of Holocaust. How do you comment about this separation between by fault or by intention?
I think what Roger said right now is a very excellent example of moral disengagement. It's basically, what you said is basically what work disengagement says, I know that I committed bad things, but I disengage from them by saying that they did it, or they're responsible, which is a good current example for the same phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for showing the complexity of this whole issue, because I think there are no one recipe that we can take that, okay, that's how to do it, but I think we have a lot of point of view, what we have to take into account. And I think it's perhaps the most difficult thing on earth to reconcile and to make peace. So thank you very much.